I'm just saying that whoever it is, right? Eric, how are you? Good. Yeah. As opposed to what you're doing.
How could you be teaching
Yeah.
Eric, hi, I'm Erik.
Erik, good to see you again.
Good. Well, I'm kind of see. Yeah, I'm doing the same thing you're doing, only at, different pace. Same pace, probably. Same maniacal pace, I might add. Slightly different approach.
Well, well, whatever you
You're
want.
going to go, what, 30 minutes maybe?
Yeah, something I was
30,
told
40?
for about 30 to 40 minutes exactly.
Yeah.
And I could be shorter too if you want, or whatever you think.
And then I think just let you guys, what, 5 or 10 minutes? That works. And then, I'll ask a few questions. Yeah, but I think we want to keep this talk for 5-10 minutes, and then we'll see how much time is left, and I'll ask some questions. Yeah. But I take it everybody wants to get out of here by 5. Is it their travel schedules?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Okay. Well,
Yeah,
I'll keep
well,
an eye
I can
out.
stay a few minutes afterwards if I need, because I've got a 6 o'clock Acela train to New York.
Oh, so you're in good shape. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, in fact,
Yeah.
I've got nothing to do between 5 and 6. I'm giving another speech, and so I'm got to get to New York, so I'm going to use the train. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, it's every hour, so I got on to 6 o'clock. Should be good.
I know, I really like taking the train.
Right. Oh, that is great. What's the difference between the Acela and the Metro line? It's Metro line.
To New York, it's about half hour, 45 minutes.
I mean-
the Acela's just faster, it takes fewer stops.
I see.
So it's like a direct versus a local.
Yeah. Because the Metro line used to be the Express, and now it's...
Yeah. It's now, the Acela is,
Pretty fast.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's 2.5 hours.
Yeah, 2.5.
Yeah,
Which, if you're doing business in Midtown or something, it's
Perfect.
I know.
I went up
oh, I did. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just like the
for
way
the
to go.
day.
I wish, Durham had those types of connections, That would be nice. That would be good. I love D.C. It's so central.
Documents.
There you go.
There's that thing. There's that thing. We'll use this thing. That's just the talking points. Put that here.
I think they're
People are telling us stuff you might not remember that.
They're oppressed in the audience as well.
By the way, do you want to sit here on the theory that you're the moderator? Or
Yeah,
does it
I'm
matter?
fine down here.
Okay. Oh, it should be. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can go to a meeting at the panel, and then I can go to the previous person. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure people are going to stay tuned.
Yeah. Sure. And that's how I pose my talk. It's generating questions. It's more interesting.
My glasses. That's awfully good thing.
Good afternoon. My name is Matt Burns. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Georgetown Law Journal. I would like to welcome you all here for our panel discussion of Professor Stephen Schwartz's article on systemic risk, which was an article that was published in the first issue of the current volume of the Georgetown Law Journal, which came out in November. When our articles committee chooses articles and talks about what we'd like to publish, something that often comes up is whether an article will be timely 6 months later when it actually sees print. There are usually concerns about whether the Supreme Court will decide a case that, in a sense, moots the article, or whether it just won't be a topic of interest anymore. It's somewhat extraordinary, as was the case for this article, that the article is perhaps more relevant and more timely when it comes to print than it is when we decide to publish it. That's, I think, fortunate for our publication, but unfortunate for just about everyone else. So the article, again, is called Systemic Risk. It provides a framework for discussing market risk and risk to markets. And Professor Schwarz is going to talk about not only the article itself, but some of the applications to the current financial crisis. I'd like to thank a few people, in particular Wayne Pollock, for putting together today's event. And I would also like to thank all of you for coming. I know you're all busy and there's a lot going on this week, but you're probably not quite as busy as all of our panelists, who we would also like to thank for coming. So after Professor Schwarz talks to you about his article, we'll have a discussion with our panelists, who include Laura Ellen Kodres, who is the chief of the Global Financial Stability Division at the IMF, as well as Erik Sirri, who is the director of the Division of Trading and Markets at the SEC. And that panel discussion will be moderated by our own Professor Donald Langevoort. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Schwarz. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's see, if I were to use this, actually I don't think there's a mic on that, so I will use this. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. I'm deeply honored to present the inaugural Georgetown Law Journal author lecture. And I want to thank Matt Burns and Wayne Pollock. Wayne, who is the special project editor, I've never seen anyone quite as diligent in terms of a law review editor. Everything work, and I really appreciate that. Because the topic of systemic risk is no longer purely academic. I'm going to attempt to, in my talk, link systemic risk and the article's theoretical to the current subprime crisis. And to that end, let me start by giving you an overview of the crisis, since some of you may be, I'm sure no one's unfamiliar with it, but some of you may be less familiar than others. Now, my article used an example of a hedge fund failing as a trigger of a systemic collapse. And that probably is the only thing in the article that didn't really anticipate what was happening, in a sense. We're now in a global credit and financial crisis, and we referred to it to some extent in its early stages as a subprime mortgage crisis. Mortgage loans were made available to even risky borrowers, very risky people who perhaps couldn't pay it back on a cash flow. But there were several reasons besides greed of the originating bankers and other lenders as to why these loans were made. Now, and I'm saying this just to give you a perspective, there are some who blame the originators of the loans, and to some extent they should be blamed, but there is another story. Lending to risky borrowers followed a time-tested credit card model in some extent, in which basically credit, I'm sure those of you who are students all have credit cards, and those of you who are students and have credit cards probably can't pay them necessarily because you have no income, but yet you have the credit cards. The theory is that credit cards are made available to virtually everyone, and there is a certainty that some percentage is going to default. But the concept is that statistically, most people will pay their credit cards, and the high rate of interest on the credit cards will offset the risk of default. And the mortgage loans to the so-called subprime loans follow this model, but was even better because you not only had, one way out in terms of cash flow, you also had the collateral of the mortgage itself, the security interest in the property. Now, this model worked well as long as home prices appreciated. And part of the model was that for people who had to pay, that they would refinance based on the increasing home prices. The model also was consistent with the government's encouragement of lenders to make loans to poor people who included a disproportionately high number of minorities. And in addition, one could even view this from a philosophical point of view. There is a well-known economist, Hernando de Soto in Peru, who wrote a book called Why Capitalism Succeeds in the West and Fails Everywhere Else. And his argument was that if you have a system that where you can borrow based upon de facto rights in property, then you could raise capital and invest in business and make money. But in many countries around the world, the poor do not have ownership in terms of legal ownership, and de facto property rights are not recognized. You can say that in terms of loans which were made to some of the subprime borrowers who did not have income that was documented, that de facto, many of them actually had income, and the loans to them follow this Hernando de Soto model. I'm not saying that's how lenders viewed it. I'm simply giving you that. So there were some legitimate reasons why these loans were made. Now, the financial crisis we're presently in resulted from a cascade of failures. Initially, it was triggered by the falling value of home prices. Home prices basically have come down more in terms of, since they've come down since the Great Depression. And you might argue that this drop in home prices was completely unanticipated. Using a Monty Python analogy, if you remember the skit, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, okay? See who's actually old enough to laugh at that. It's been a while back, but it's very cute. Something that happens once, back in 1492, and hasn't happened since. You don't anticipate it. On the other hand, some may say that the drop in home prices should have been anticipated because there was this huge liquidity glut that took place before we had the fall in home prices. Basically, credit was dirt cheap, and people were able to finance anything, and that caused the home prices to rise because there was so much demand. But whether or not it should have been anticipated, the fall in housing prices basically meant that low-income borrowers, these subprime borrowers who could not refinance through home appreciation, were more likely to default and walk away from their homes. And even those borrowers who could afford mortgages, to some extent, might be walking away where the value of their homes is lower than the amount of the loans. As a result of all these defaults in mortgage loans, there were substantial amounts of low investment grade rated, what are referred to as mortgage-backed securities. And if I had more time, I would use a whiteboard and explain to you. But think of it this way. Mortgage-backed securities in the simplest form is you get a pool or your grouping of mortgage loans, and you then put them into a special purpose vehicle, or SPV. The special purpose vehicle issues securities. And those securities, the proceeds of those securities, are used essentially to finance or refinance the mortgages. Now, those are the basic types of mortgage-backed securities, or MBS. There was then a second generation above that called CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, where you had different pools of mortgage-backed securities and sometimes other assets pooled together and was the basis of the issuance of securities. And then you had a third generation issue, you get beyond this, but called ABS CDOs, asset-backed security CDOs, where you then had these special purpose vehicles invest in CDO securities. If you don't follow that, don't worry about it. The point is that it's very complicated, okay? And that's part of the problem. It was so complicated that many of the investors, although they should have understood the risk they were taking on when they bought these securities, didn't completely appreciate it. As a result, there wasn't really a sufficient credit analysis. The investors who basically bought the investment-grade rated securities saw some of them go into default. Investors who even bought AAA rated securities, the highest rating by the rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Moody's, saw the ratings be reduced from AAA to lower forms of investment grade. And fewer investors at this point, well, investors basically got spooked, because if you can't rely on the ratings, what are you going to rely on? Some might say you're supposed to do your due diligence as investors, but I should mention that, for better or for worse, many of the investors did not do adequate due diligence. So investors got spooked. They started losing confidence in ratings, debt securities. Fewer investors meant that the price of debt securities started falling. Now, falling prices meant that firms that used debt securities as collateral had to, under accounting standards, mark them to market. That is, mark the value of these securities in their financial statements down from the initial price they had it to the resulting or the subsequent market price, which was much lower. And this caused a downward death spiral, because the prices, as many firms started having to mark it down, the more they marked it down, in some cases, they then had to sell other securities to basically collateralize, I should say, some of their obligations. And selling those securities meant the market price went even lower, and you had to mark it down again. You had this cascade. Now, this cascade was exacerbated in mid-September when the government failed to save Lehman Brothers, and this was after Fannie and Freddie was taken over, essentially. And debt markets at that point became so spooked that even the commercial paper market, the market for short-term corporate promissory notes, clutched up. It virtually shut down. And the mortgage prices of mortgage-backed securities, the prices of mortgage-backed securities dropped precipitously. These events, I would argue, epitomize systemic risk, which essentially in this case here would be a chain of failures triggered by one collapse which affects different markets and different institutions. And as a result of these reductions in value of the mortgage-backed securities that were owned by various institutions, the institutions, and a result of marking them down to their market value, the institutions now appeared to be riskier. Before, let's say yesterday, you'd have an institution that would have assets valued at X, and the next day the asset value would go down to X minus some amount, and so forth and so on. And the riskiness, the risky perception, created what is referred to sometimes as counterparty risk. And that is that parties who dealt with these institutions were concerned that these institutions might not be sufficiently financially viable to pay them back. And institutions basically stopped with other financial institutions. Now, the entire system started coming to a halt, and the federal government stepped into the rescue in October with the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, ESA. And that, I think, has been very good. It's not perfect, but I think what's very important is that the government is taking emergency action, and the markets, at least, are beginning to respond to it. There are various issues in ESA. For example, you have the so-called Trouble Asset Recovery Program, the TARP, T-A-R-P. How should we, basically, the government, try to stabilize financial institutions? Should they, for example, assets, mortgage assets in the form of underlying mortgage loans to try to stabilize the institutions, or should they buy stock in the institutions? And it really, the government is doing both. I think at this point, the primary emphasis buying stock in the various institutions, and there are potential accounting reasons and certainly appearance reasons why that's better. I can go into the details of why I think that the government also could purchase the assets themselves equally well, but that's something maybe we should save for the Q&A. Now, basically, the question is, the more important question at this stage, well, not more important, but the sort of future question is, what should be done to avoid future systemic financial crises? I'm not saying that the present crisis is resolved or is going to be resolved, but I'm trying to sort of at least go back to the article itself. And it's impossible to know precisely how any given financial crisis will arise in the future. So I think the key is to remain open and remain flexible. Part of my concern is that the government may have acted with a degree of tunnel vision in the last year. A large part of the spearheading of the crisis was done by the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is chartered under the Federal Reserve Act, Section 13.3, to basically provide liquidity to banks and other financial institutions. One of the arguments I make in this article is that that focus is good, but it may no longer be sufficient now that we have increasingly what's referred to as disintermediation. And this is the shifting of financing, sources of financing, from banks and other financial institutions to the capital markets directly. And so you often see companies, firms that finance themselves by issuing securities directly or indirectly to the capital markets, financial markets, without going or other financial intermediaries. There are various lessons we may learn from that. For example, perhaps in the future, we should have a government entity that integrates all the entities around, not only looks to, for example, the Federal Reserve that has specific power, but looks to all the different types of governmental entities and tries to coordinate them. In the UK, for example, you have the FSA, Financial Services Administration, and that is a single entity. I'm not convinced the FSA is the most efficient organization around based on my dealings with them. And what I would advocate, and I haven't done a lot of study of this, is at the very least we go slowly into trying to integrate our organizations and maybe have some sort of umbrella organization at the outset so that it tries to at least gain a perspective. Now, also, to protect against future crises, we should try to look at what the lessons are from the existing crisis. And I've studied that in another paper. And I believe there are at least 3 things that went wrong in the existing crisis, potentially a 4th. And I'll describe them by each with a term under a category with a. There is conflicts of interest, so you have conflicts. There is complacency, and there is complexity. So complacency and complexity. And this is all exacerbated by the 4th category of cupidity or greed, so the 4 C's. And so one way of looking at this is how can we address these categories of, types of things that went wrong. In addition to these categories, I would argue, there is a 4th category, and that is the problem of systemic risk, which could result from one of these categories, but even if these categories didn't exist, could also result from its own category, and that is, I liken in the article, systemic risk to a type of tragedy of the commons. And many of you have studied tragedy of the commons, the issue of everyone has common land and the sheep graze. No one has, if anyone who has sheep that has a right to graze, then no one is going to say their sheep shouldn't overgraze the land because someone else's sheep will overgraze the land. And you have that same problem with, I think, systemic risk. That is, the benefits of exploiting finite capital resources accrue to individual market participants, on the one hand, whereas the costs of the exploitation, which in our case will affect the real economy, or Main Street as they say, are distributed among an even wider class of persons. And therefore, even in a very simple financial system with no complexity, even if in a financial system with no conflicts, and with hyper-diligent market participants, I think that systemic risk is theoretically possible. Now, let me just briefly address some of these categories, the conflicts and complacency and complexity. Conflicts are, I think, were endemic in the recent financial crisis. There were various ways. One type of conflict was in the originate and distribute model. You had banks and other financial institutions make loans. But the problem was that these loans were not intended to stay on these originating institutions' balance sheets. They weren't supposed to be preserved as assets. Instead, they were originated with the intention of selling them off to third parties. And this was done through that SPV structure, through the mortgage-backed securities, sometimes referred to as MBS, the CDOs, the ABS CDOs arrangements. And it was third parties, investors in the securities issued by those SPVs that ultimately took the risk. So the party that originated the assets was not the same party that bore the risk on those assets, or essentially the risk on the assets. You could try to arrange and modify that system in some ways. What baffles me, though, is why that conflict, to the extent it is a conflict, was troublesome. Because think of it logically. Logically, if you're the ultimate investor in the securities issued by one of these SPVs, even though it's originated by the originator or bank, as the ultimate investor, if you take the risk, you should do your due diligence, or you should basically impose on the originator the standards that you will insist on to purchase these assets. And it is somewhat of a mystery why those ultimate investors, and in many cases, third-party institutions called monoline insurance companies that guaranteed those investors did not do the adequate due diligence. And part of the answer may be an issue of complexity, that things were so complex that they didn't really understand how much problems they were getting into. Other types of conflicts would be conflicts, more typical agency cost issues. And this would be, for example, an officer, an investment analyst at a particular company that invests, which would say, we want, I, Joe Blow, say the company should invest in such and such securities, and at that point, I will get my bonus for the year. Now, if that bonus is not subject to being reclaimed, essentially, or clawed back, if it turns out that investment ultimately fails, that is a type of conflict of interest. You basically have the individuals look to the short term, whereas the institutions they work for and the investors in those institutions look also to the long term. And that is troublesome, and the ESA statute basically attempts in a limited way to address those issues. And I think that needs to be addressed. Now, there are some concerns with conflicts of interest. For example, what if you have some officer who gets paid, $25 million, and let's say $10 million of that is subject to be clawed back, but it turns out, and it is clawed back, but that officer says, so what? I still get at least $15 million. I'm financially independent. That in itself creates a certain innate conflict of interest. So the question is whether compensation above some levels create conflicts of interest, even if a portion of that could be clawed back. Now we'll turn to complacency, and this is troublesome because human nature can't be changed. Government can try to change behavior. The problem here, though, is that experience shows, and there's actually some data on this that was done by Business Week based on a Marriott restructuring in the early 90s, that no matter how observant people are to problems at the time there's a crisis, a number of years out, they forget everything for the higher return, or as Business Week said, they'll go for the gold. And, this is a problem that we're only human. Complexity, the third category, is the most difficult, I think, of these three categories. And I think in some ways it's increasingly a metaphor of the financial system. And this comes in two flavors, so to speak. You have, I think, cognizant complexity. Things are just too complex to understand. And this might manifest itself in the failure of disclosure. I think that disclosure as a remedy or as a solution is losing some of its value as things become increasingly complex. I had lunch with a very senior official here in D.C. I'm not going to say who it was. And he was telling me that there was discussions with some investor groups. Well, what do we need to do? Should we increase the amount of complexity? And the investors said, for God's sakes, no, because they won't have to read that. We don't read it anyway. We don't want to be responsible for not reading, and the more you give us, the more it'll cost. And so there are issues as to how we deal with that. There's also temporal complexity in the sense of sometimes our financial systems work in a way that the consequences can happen so quickly that there's no time to basically step back and control it. And this is sometimes referred to as tight coupling. There's a book that Rick Bookstaber wrote, Demons of Our Own Design, wrote about the financial system. And Rick uses the term tight coupling, which comes from engineering, where you have an effect that basically goes through the system. And I think his term is a good one. And obviously very difficult to solve the problems of, the problem of complexity. Let's see. Okay, you also have, I'm going to actually skip over part. One thought I have, and I'll get to a little bit later, is how one might attempt to address complexity. And one possible solution might be, I'm not saying it's the only one, and I'm not saying it necessarily will work, I'm simply raising it for consideration, as to whether there should be some sort of market liquidity provider of last resort. We presently have, as you all know, the Federal Reserve that acts as an institutional liquidity provider of last resort. So, you have AIG. AIG is about to fail. It would have systemic consequences. The Fed steps in and basically provides emergency money to AIG. On the other hand, it let Lehman Brothers fail, and it does that because it doesn't want to create a concept known as moral hazard, where it makes people completely reliant on the federal government. And those of you who own cars will probably understand moral hazard if you think of your car insurance. There's always a deductible. Why is there a deductible? Because without a deductible, you're going to drive unsafely. Okay, and a deductible means you bear the first dollars of loss to $500, $1,000, maybe more, which will be an incentive for you not to behave risky. And that's the same thing with financial institutions. If the government basically assured every financial institution that it would stand behind it, then financial institutions would have an incentive to act in a more risky fashion. Now, the concept of this liquidity provider, the market liquidity provider, would function somewhat like an institutional liquidity provider, as I've described, except the concept here is that you'd have some government institution that would not basically support firms, but would actually support financial markets. So, for example, the mortgage-backed securities market, if you see that a market is irrationally panicking, the concept is that liquidity provider could come in or choose to come in, buy securities in that market at some discount from the price, the then market price, but above a price to which the market might ultimately collapse. To give an example, mortgage-backed securities, I was expert for the High Court of Justice in England this summer in a case where we actually looked at this in connection with the Orion Finance structured investment vehicle. The market price of various mortgage-backed securities was about 22 cents on the dollar. It had fallen that low. If you, on the other hand, you did an analysis and you look through the securities down to the underlying mortgage loans, and you look to what portion is subprime, what portion is prime, what portion is in default, what portion is likely to go into default, you could compute, and if you present value it, and if you don't know present value, I'm not going to go into it now, but if you looked at that and you looked at the expected cash flows and present value them, you come up with a value of those securities cents on the dollar as opposed to 22 cents on the dollar. And you might ask, what is going on? And what's going on is there is some sort of irrationality element where the market is in panic and can't properly value it. And it's in this case only, that I think a market liquidity provider has some sort of role. Now, having looked at those issues, let's step back to the more theoretical nature, the concept of the tragedy of the commons. And here the question is that there are some things that market participants will do to externalize a risk that it's in their self-interest to do because they're going to make more money even if there's a systemic collapse of the market. In this case, one clearly needs regulation. The problem is, how do you regulate this? Because here you have the question of fighting the last war. For example, the problem in this crisis is that the mortgage loans were made badly. You didn't have essentially enough collateral. Now, you could use a solution. You could do a number of things. Increase the criteria by which originators make the loans to subprime borrowers. You could do that. You can say there need to be better standards. Of course, you do have consequences there. That means that a lot of people are not going to, who otherwise might have been able to buy homes, will not be able to afford homes. Maybe that's good. Maybe that's rational, but that's simply a choice society has to make. Another thing that one might do, and this was done after the Great Depression, basically imposed by the Fed, was to impose certain margin requirements. For example, in the Great Depression, one problem is that banks had made loans secured by stock, and the proceeds of those loans were used to purchase stock, okay? And the stock that was purchased secured the loan. So you had one-to-one value ratio. Or to be concrete, I borrow $1,000. I use $1,000 to buy $1,000 of stock. I pledge $1,000 of stock to secure my loan to the bank. As long as the stock market keeps going up, the bank is going to get repaid. And when the stock market went down a little bit, then banks started not being repaid, and the failure of the banks to be repaid basically created this systemic effect. You could create this issue, collateralize, mortgage loans, 2-to-1 or something. Say that if you borrow, money to buy a house, the amount of the home that you pledge as collateral has got to exceed the amount of the loan, essentially put down more equity. But again, what you're doing is you're making home ownership harder to come by, and which may be good, but it is, again, a political and policy solution. There are other issues in terms of derivatives, which I'm not sure I have enough time to get into now, so I'm going to skip it, and anyone who wants to talk about credit derivatives and such, I'd be happy to do that afterwards. The problem with trying to spot specific issues and to regulate specific things that went wrong is that you are likely to miss what could go wrong the next time. And so what we had is to come back to this market liquidity provider. Nothing is going to cause a complete systemic collapse if you actually have a liquidity provider of last resort, both for institutions and now, given the disintermediation, also for the markets. And so I would argue that if we had some sort of market liquidity provider, potentially it could step in to at least take out the irrationality of the market. There are questions as to whether governments can actually come in, though, and with enough money to control markets. And you might analogize this to efforts by governments to control their currency exchange markets, which have failed miserably except in Hong Kong. And the question is, the reason Hong Kong succeeded is that you had not only strong reserves in Hong Kong, but you also implicitly had all of China's reserves behind it. Now, I would argue that trying to control, let's say, the value in debt markets is very different than trying to control currency exchange markets. Currency exchange markets, all the types of issues that basically address the country's financial health, whereas looking at a debt market is much more targeted based on the debt securities themselves. And also, if you have a reliable market liquidity provider, which sets a price and basically demonstrates that the price is a rational, discounted price, you could reduce some of the information asymmetry that you have that causes the markets to drop. And so that's at least one thing that I raise. And with that, I think I've about my allotted time, I will turn the panel over.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, we're going to turn to our two panelists here for about 10 minutes worth of comments each. Eventually, we want to get to a point where the audience gets to ask questions, so be thinking. Laura, do you want to go first?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me today. I think this is, as was pointed out, a more topical topic than anybody counted on 6 months ago or even a year ago. And certainly Mr. Schwartz's paper and his discussion has provided a lot of useful ways to think about systemic risk. There's certainly much to agree with in the piece and a number of relevant insights about the current systemic crisis that we are now faced with. In my remarks, let me just pose a couple of issues that I think might be helpful for general discussion. And there are issues that I think should have deserved sort of greater attention in the paper or maybe greater clarity. The first one is about the definition of systemic risk. Steve's general observation that systemic risk is no longer just a bank-based issue is certainly true. Non-bank intermediaries are now prevalent. Their relationships with banks are more complex, and they're more important than they have been in previous decades and certainly in previous cases of systemic crises. That said, a systemic financial crisis rarely remains in the non-bank sphere, even if it starts there. And the most austere problems are still caused by banks' inability to be the intermediaries that they function as in the economy. Moreover, even if corporations in the United States use capital markets for financing, banks' role in the household sector is still a vital one, and in most countries, banks still are the backbone of both the corporate and the household sector in terms of financing investments. The point is that we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that we just now need to focus on the non-bank sector and somehow forget about banks, that the focus of any new regulation has got to incorporate a larger perimeter of types of institutions and think harder about what we think of as being systemically important. A second issue is raised that is, I think, is more specific to this most recent episode, but I think it's going to be a recurrent theme when we look forward into other possible crises. In the past, there have been sort of two types of problems when a systemic crisis has arisen. There are typically deposit runs in banks, which is a typical funding liquidity problem, and then bank failures, which is characterized as a solvency problem. In practice, even in these simple cases that you can identify bank runs and insolvencies, these two issues are usually intertwined, and it's very seldom do you find one without subsequently finding the other. The current crisis is different in the sense that we have two different liquidity problems. They're not just of the order of a typical bank run. In fact, more or less in this country, we've almost solved bank runs, although not entirely, as we come to see from several banks in this country and Northern Rock in the UK. Nonetheless, I think it would have been useful to separate two types of liquidity. The type of liquidity that's discussed most heavily in Steve's paper is what I will term market liquidity. It's the liquidity in a market for a specific asset, and basically it refers to the ability to buy and sell at a price close to the previous price when you attempt to sell in some sort of reasonable size. The trigger of this crisis was largely related to this market illiquidity, as many of the structured credit products that had been sold to various parties, including these special purpose vehicles, became difficult to value when U.S. housing market prices started to fall apart and the market liquidity for this set of assets essentially dried up. However, the more important type of liquidity that has driven the problems really over the last year, since last August 2007, has been what we call funding liquidity. And it turns out that many of those illiquid assets that were sitting in these structured investment vehicles or conduits or special purpose vehicles, however you want to call them, were being funded by short-term investments, often asset-backed commercial paper. In fact, the same assets that were purchased into the SPV were used as the backing for the short-term commercial paper that funded them. And this maturity mismatch, and then the inability to offload the assets at any reasonable price or get the providers of the asset-backed commercial paper to continue to roll over, is what really made markets very nervous. So when these illiquid assets were sitting on these off-balance sheet types of vehicles and their funding liquidity dried up, that was really a turning point in the crisis. Most of these SIVs or conduits managed to draw on their bank's contingent credit lines and get liquidity that way. Some of them had to be closed up and sold, in which case those losses were transferred to those financial institutions. And at this point, it was a reaction, it was an interaction between the illiquidity in the markets for the structured credit products alongside the funding illiquidity that were related to them that really caused what now can be viewed as this counterparty risk that people are focusing on, and ultimately the solvency problems that we're now experiencing. A third area that I thought deserved more attention is the degree of information asymmetry, both across institutions and between the private sector and what I would call just a general lack of information about how these new markets were constructed, how they functioned, and especially how the risks were distributed. Many people viewed these instruments as being a way in which to transfer risks to people, quote unquote, more able to bear those risks. And the thought was that this would allow banks to move off their balance sheets many of these risks and push them into areas of other types of institutions that would be better able to hold them. As this unraveled, people began to notice that these structured credit products were indeed not held by other people outside the banking system, but were often either related directly or indirectly. And then, as a consequence of the uncertainty of their value, uncertainty is about who held what, who needed the liquidity, and whether or not these institutions were solvent or not, all led to market dysfunction. These were what I would call the regular uncertainties about the economic fundamentals. That is, where was the U.S. housing market going and how many foreclosures were there? Those are still high sort of fundamental uncertainties. You add that to the set of uncertainties about how these instruments were structured and who owns them, and now you get a serious breakdown in the functioning of markets. And this is when you saw really the breakdown in the interbank market. Subsequently, you saw a breakdown in the commercial paper market. You saw it in the municipal bond market. And so you start to see these linkages occurring because of all of the uncertainty that's resolving around what initially we thought was a relatively small contained problem. Arguably, the most problematic of these was the interbank market. Here, the paper that Steve has presented seems to argue that the Fed relied pretty much on its traditional role and failed to adequately quell the problems of liquidity that were arising. And I'll grant you that interbank markets right now are not functioning as well as we would like. But I would also add that it's not for lack of trying by the central banks. The Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, and now a host of other central banks have pushed the envelope in a number of areas in dealing with systemic liquidity problems. They've widened the number of counterparties that they deal with for emergency liquidity support. They've increased the breadth of collateral that they're willing to take as backup for that liquidity. They've altered pricing. They've altered auction mechanics. And they've increasingly supplied liquidity to non-banks. Witness the fact that both Goldman and Morgan Stanley have become banks in order to access the Fed's balance sheet. We have the Fed now intermediating in the commercial paper market, something that was absolutely unheard of a year and a half ago. 5 years ago, you wouldn't have even dreamed of that in your worst nightmare. So these are areas in which the Fed has really extended its reach, not just to banks, but increasingly to other areas. Now, the reason for this is not because there's not adequate liquidity in the system. There is billions, literally billions of dollars roaming around in the system. The issue is it's not getting to the right places. And the reason it's not getting to the right places is because banks still don't trust each other, and so they're hoarding the liquidity for themselves. They're uncertain about how many of those contingent credit lines are going to be quite sure what the value of the securities are that they're going to try to fund. And as a result, everyone is keeping the liquidity close at hand and instead of lending it to the households and to the corporations. So I think what's useful is to identify these different aspects of the systemic crisis, the differences between market and funding liquidity, and the role of asymmetric and, in my view, insufficient information, and because both of these three areas have a bearing on how you would construct policies to fix the problem or at least mitigate future problems of this nature. Let me make a couple of comments on those sort of future areas of regulation. One is on disclosure. Most of the time we think of disclosure as a good thing. And in fact, for the most part, we think more is better. But the present situation is a case where I think we need to think carefully about what we mean by disclosure and the costs and benefits of it. There are at least three issues about disclosure that are relevant in today's financial distress. First, since a large part of the current problem is uncertainty about the pricing of various complex securities, and the models underlying those securities would be helpful for those people trying to value them. That way they can compare methods and assumptions. This is happening. Credit rating agencies are providing more of these underpinnings about the assumptions and about their modeling techniques. Other institutions are providing a lot more information about how they're valuing them in their accounting disclosures. And while there are issues about the proprietary models of these pricing, I think in general this type of disclosure is the way forward, at least for the current set of complex price securities. Second, another part of the problem is the information about exposures to various types of assets and the liability structures that underpin them. Here, the idea of public disclosure becomes a little bit more problematic. In general, during normal times, the notion that the public should know what their publicly traded institutions have on their balance sheets, and in that fact, off balance sheet, is relevant for the pricing of their securities, of their equities, of their bonds, and even one could argue the depositors should know what it is if it's in a bank. The problem comes in when conditions are not normal. In fact, information revelation about exposures that's unexpected alters the risk and return assessment by potential investors. This obviously can cause more systemic risk than you had originally. So putting aside the fact that it costs money to produce the information about exposures and distribute it, there's a social cost associated with the information revelation that could lead to a run on a bank, either through a classic deposit run or a run on its capital, that is, a sale of its publicly traded equity, that in the causes more difficulties than it solves. Dramatic changes in disclosure requirements thus have to be sensitive to the environment in which they're introduced. Information about how to interpret the disclosures is also critical to avoid this sort of increased unwinding or forced acceleration of sales of assets. Moreover, level playing fields are very important, so the information disclosure should be consistent not only across types of institutions that hold these kinds of instruments, but also across countries. That's very problematic. Third element of public disclosure, and that is the way in which we think about market discipline. Normally we think about market discipline as disciplining bad behavior that can be stemmed in some sense by people knowing what that bad behavior might look like. But now we need to think about disclosure in a new way. Not about necessarily public disclosure, but we need to think about disclosure to other counterparties, exposure data amongst the group of individuals holding these kinds of securities. It's a different kind of disclosure. It's not a public disclosure, but it allows the counterparties themselves to view what they're exposed to each other. And if it can be aggregated or if it can be produced in a way that disguises each individual counterparty, it can work to make the system more stable. In some countries, notably in Germany, follow this model a little bit. What it does is the exposures of banks to a corporation, and then if a new bank wants to loan to that particular corporation, they can go into the credit register and see how much other exposure exists to that corporation, and thereby be able to see how they're adding to the systemic ability, if you will, of that corporation to repay. Another way is to think about these exposures and the liability structures underpinning them shared with some central arm's length entity that can verify for the rest of the market the extent to which the safety and soundness of that institution is compromised by the exposures and the funding structures. This is the same idea that would be sort of embedded in a CAMEL rating that the U.S. banking supervisors put forth. So they evaluate an entity, they give you a rating or an evaluation, and thereby, even if you don't know all of the components, you know that more or less the institution is a sound one and can be relied upon in various business operations. Now, there's no need, in essence, for this to be a regulator. It need not also be a formal institution. It could even be done by a private institution if, in fact, there were enough protections and it was reliable. In some areas, like the IMF also provides this role to a limited extent in its Global Financial Stability Report, where it looks at cross-border types of exposures. The Bank of International Settlements produces a lot of data about banking cross-border exposures that can be used to assess the riskiness of individual sovereign entities. The point is that if you're going to mitigate systemic risks, you have to think about these notions of uncertainty, you have to think about asymmetric information, and you have to think about how that information could be distributed in order to get the heart of the problem, and at the same time not circumvent a competitive market. So while the information provision and disclosure appears always to be in the interest of individual investors, there are senses in which information disclosure is not helpful to the system as a whole. And that's where we need to think a little bit more carefully about what we mean by information provision and where. My last comment is on the global aspects of systemic risk. Clearly, in my role at the IMF, I would be remiss if I didn't say something about the global aspects of systemic risk. I think there are at least two areas where this is incredibly important. The first, and I think Steve would support this, is on the liquidity provision. This is obviously a key issue, and it's one in which the IMF is already working to provide liquidity in the sense of to countries to provide to their markets in order for things to move smoothly. The IMF announced a new facility last week. It's called the Short-Term Liquidity Facility, or the SLF, and it's in part to address this global provision of liquidity. The Fed has generously supplied liquidity to countries in Europe, advanced countries, through what was called the TAF, which they put forth last December 2007. That was to a few countries, the UK, Switzerland, and the ECB. And they have recently extended into a different facility to the countries of Mexico, Brazil, Korea, and Singapore. That still leaves, in my mind, another 160 countries that are in our membership that are not covered by the Fed's swap arrangement. And I think this new facility is meant to treat those other countries that are having difficulty, particularly obtaining dollars, but countries that the Fed views as probably too small or too risky to deal with. And this is an area where we can add value. A second area that clearly demands a global attention is in the area of monitoring risks and regulations. Ideally, regulatory arbitrage, that is the idea that regulation in certain types of institutions or products is onerous in some jurisdictions than others, is generally a problem for global financial stability. So a consistent set of regulatory or supervisory constructs, however you want to think about it, across borders would help to remove risks, or at least allow them to be monitored in a way where one can point to discrepancies and risks and vulnerabilities building up. This is an area where a set of best practices or standards can help in terms of providing some guidance to countries as to how to set up regulatory responses. Examples are already out there: the Basel Core Principles, the IOSCO, which is the International Association of Securities Commissions. What is it, IOSCO?
International Organization of Security Commission.
What's the O at the end? Organized. They have a set of core principles. the others. And of course, many of these things are adopted purely on a voluntary basis. And the problem, I think, so far has been that no one checks the adherence to the principles. And even if they check the adherence to the principle, there's no stick. There's no way of penalizing those that do not attend to the principles. And so there needs to be some more teeth in both the principles and their enforcement going forward. It's not clear exactly how to set this up in a way that encourages countries to adopt them, because if in case they don't get far enough, that's not a good incentive. We need some more carrots in terms of how to encourage these best principles, but it's pretty clear that the fund would have a role to play in this. The Financial Stability Forum, the Bank of International Settlements, the Basel Committee should be working forward to step to the plate and get more rigor into the types of standards and provide some sort of follow-up, either with hard-hitting analysis of when they're not satisfied or some other mechanism to try to improve enforcement. I'll leave my remarks here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm sure Erik has some views.
Oh, and Don, can I just say just 10 seconds?
10 seconds.
10 seconds. I agree with much of what Laura said, and I think her comments. Just one thought at the beginning in terms of my definition of systemic risk. I do focus on the non-bank sphere as well as the bank sphere and the institutional sphere. The only point I was making in terms of disintermediation is that we need to look to markets as well as institutions. And in fact, in the paper on page 202, it says that from an institutional standpoint, it's not only banks but other financial institutions that should be viewed from systemic risk, and we need to consider them. And this, I think, is what the Fed has been doing when it looks to institutions like AIG and so forth.
Okay, Erik.
Thank you. I thought I'd talk about a couple specifics instead of generalities about systemic risk. Before I start, I've got to give you this disclaimer. Anything I say represents my own view and not any of the views of my colleagues at the Commission nor any of the commissioners. That said, so I thought I'd talk about 2 or 3 absolutely specific instances of systemic risk. And this stuff is horribly scary when you do it. So we regulated Goldman, Lehman, Morgan, Bear, and Merrill. So they got hit, and there were systemic risk components to it. So let me talk about one first, which is a market you may or may not know. It's called the repurchase market. So just like you understand that a bank funds itself with deposits, a securities firm, a Goldman Sachs, funds itself in the repo market, which is a very strange market if you don't understand it. It's pretty easy to understand. Suppose you have $2 and you want to buy $100 of securities, and the question is, can you do it? And the answer, in a safe way, and the answer is absolutely not a problem in the world. What you do is, with your left hand, you go out and buy $100 of securities. All right? So you say, all right, you get them. And they say, wait a minute, I'll pay you in a minute. Then here, you take your securities, and you hand them over here to Laura. And Laura takes the $100 of securities, and she gives me back $98. So it's a secured loan to her. It's a good loan. She lent me $98 on $100 of securities, so it's secured. If I welch on the deal, she's got my securities, so that's good. Take her 98 plus my 2, that's 100, give it to that guy, and I'm done. I own those things, but they're at her house, and I've got all my securities. That's repo. Now, the repurchase market is the way securities firms fund themselves. Huge market. Like, you take a firm, its balance sheet could be half repo. So hundreds of billions of dollars of repo could sit on one of these big firms' balance sheet. So we regulate those firms, and you wonder, what is the repo market sensitive to credits of firms? And you would say, absolutely not, because if I blow up, she's got my $100 of security, she sells them maybe for $99, she has to give me back an extra $1, but I only borrowed $98. Now, when we supervise firms, we always knew that if things went ugly, that their ability to get financing would degrade. We assumed, and in fact happens, that they got locked out of what's known as the unsecured credit market. People wouldn't just loan them money on their good name, commercial paper. That would go away. What would your assumptions be about the repo market? Secured loans, like the one I... Well, we figured a couple things would be true. I didn't really tell you what kind of security I financed. Could have been a junk bond, but actually, would you care if I give her $100 of junk bonds or $100 of treasuries? After all, which is worth more? I got to think about that. Okay, so that works, okay? That works. In some sense, you don't matter. But let's face it, if a firm gets stressed, you probably figure treasuries are easier to finance than junk bonds, so we'll give you that. Additionally, the so-called $2 is known as a haircut. The haircut widens. Instead of $2, takes $4 that she wants as sort of equity in that deal. We anticipated that as happening. So now, and you get into this period where these firms are in trouble. Well, guess what? The repo market shuts down. Now, why would it do that? It shouldn't do that, because if I'm giving her $100 of securities and she can give me $98 or $95 or $93, but in fact, people don't want to loan me anything on my $100 of securities, which is very odd because they could just liquidate it. And it turns out the answer to that question is it depends who's doing the financing. So guess who is a very big financer of paper on the street, this kind of stuff? It's the money market mutual funds. Now, think about the business of a money market mutual fund. They're in the business, the very dull business of buying high-grade paper, holding it, and getting really, really big and making a little bit on a lot of stuff, thereby making a lot of money. But they're not in the business of liquidating collateral. So when they learn that I'm getting in trouble, they say, well, now that you mention it, even though I did only loan you 98 on my 100, on that 100, I think I'll stop doing that, because I'm not in the business of liquidating collateral. I'll rather go make a loan to Steve, who I know is not going to blow up, than make a loan to me, who I might blow up, because what's in it for them if I blow up? There's no risk premium in this market, because who are the people who lend overnight? Who would lend money overnight in the overnight repo market? They're people who are looking to earn a little more money on their cash that when they park money for their payroll. They have a $500 million payroll tomorrow, so they're going to park the money overnight. They want to earn a tiny bit on it, but they don't want to bet the payroll for an extra 10 basis points. So that market degrades catastrophically when you get in trouble, to the point where these firms, at least with respect to money market funds, could not repo treasuries. That is, I couldn't give her a money good treasury instrument and get it financed overnight. Well, that's crazy. I mean, when we plan risk scenarios, we never planned for that scenario. We never planned for a world where someone wouldn't be able to finance agency securities that had full faith and credit government guarantees, or treasuries. It's just, if we had a year ago gone up to these firms and said, in your risk scenarios, plan for this, they would have thought we were a loony. They would have said, that's never happened before in the history of finance as we know it. So, but that's a key systemic risk point that market did break down. Point is, managing systemic risk ex ante isn't so easy, because you can't anticipate what is going to break. So you can craft these solutions, but when you actually face it, as we did, as these markets slowly and then catastrophically broke down, we always ask ourselves, what would we have done differently? What we would have had to done differently in that market was to basically lock out repo for these firms. That's like going to a commercial bank that is 50% deposits and saying, you have to be able to withstand half of your deposits running out within 2 or 3 days. Well, no bank will be able to withstand that. They'll all go bankrupt. How many of you changed where your money is kept for your bank deposits in the last 6 months? See, that's a good thing about banks. Depositing. Guys were gone. They were gone in a few days, and they had multi-year relationships. It's a relationship business. So point one there is that tough business to manage from the point of view of systemic risk. So I can give you another example. Then I'll give you an example of how you craft a solution. So I don't know if you know what prime brokerage is, but prime brokerage is brokerage for big people who have a lot of money, as opposed to people like law students. This is the business of financing hedge funds. All right. So prime brokerage is probably the most profitable part of running a securities firm. Now, we have rules in the United States that we regulate, the Securities and Exchange Commission, about prime brokerage. Amongst the things we require is that a broker can't commingle its money, the house money, where that's proprietarily, with customers' money. You just can't do it. That's just a rule we have. So if you have an account You can worry about many, many things, but the one thing you don't have to worry about is that broker took your money and bet the house with it to see, and then if it loses, then it goes off to wherever it goes off to. No, it can't do that. It's got to keep your money literally in a separate box from the house money. That's not true in the UK. The UK, if you're a sophisticated investor, you can commingle your money with the house. They don't have what's known as a segregation requirement. And so big boy investors, hedge funds, will allow that. They'll get paid for that, and they can get some advantageous treatment there. So that goes on. People have known about it for decades. In fact, if you remember back about a year ago, there were these competitiveness reports about the United States. So there were 3 of them commissioned here. And amongst the things we were pressured for is that we had stiff regulations that were overly stiff, and so back and forth on that. Well, now guess what happens with Lehman Brothers? So Lehman Brothers breaks. It breaks first at 2 in the morning in the UK when the UK bank broker-dealer declares bankruptcy, 2 a.m. U.S. time. It declares bankruptcy. All of a sudden, people start thinking about what the segregation regime means, and they declare bankruptcy, so they're all locked up. Their money's not going anywhere. It's too late. But guess who panics, and guess who gets in trouble? It's Goldman Sachs, in essence, and it's Morgan Stanley, 2 perfectly healthy firms, because their clients realized that the UK broker model was imperiled and that it was more risky. So they instantly is too strong a word, suddenly pulled their money out and started withdrawing prime brokerage balances from the UK. Well, that created, it's for a complicated reason, it creates not a use of cash, but a demand of cash on the part of the broker-dealer, because prime brokerage clients, they leave balances in the firm that the firm could use. Couldn't use them anymore. And so those people started seeing a use of cash, and they needed money quickly. They all ran out of the UK into various U.S. entities, again creating a systemic from a difference in rules, but those rules were exactly what each regulatory regime wanted. They weren't so much as being arbitraged as people were selecting different risk profiles. And so that's a way a contagion passes on. So now let me give you a final example of how you can try to solve this, but it isn't so easy either. Steve passed about talking about credit default swaps, but I'll say a couple words about them because that's the example. Credit default swap is an insurance contract on a bond. Suppose you own a bond in IBM. Your deep fear is that IBM goes out of business and stops paying principal and interest. You can come to me and I'll write you an insurance contract that says if IBM doesn't make the payments, I will make them instead, or that I will buy the bond off you and give you par. It's an insurance contract that's known as a credit default swap. These are big contracts, big business, and in fact, they've gotten to the point where people, instead of buying bonds, if you think about it really carefully, instead of buying a bond, you could just write protection on them. They're almost economic substitutes. So, a $60 trillion market, depending on how you want to count. Well, the problem is whenever you enter this market and trade, you take the credit of the counterparty. So again, going back to my favorite person, Laura here, she and I may engage in a credit default swap on Steve's credit. So Steve is IBM, but fundamentally, even though I'm insuring IBM's bond, I'm taking Laura's credit. If she walks away or falls over dead or whatever it's going to be, then I don't have the insurance on Steve's bond. So that's a problem. Why is it a problem? Because when a firm like Laura gets in trouble, we all start worrying about, is she going to pay off on all the insurance contracts she wrote? And the poster child for that is, of course, AIG, who at this point has like $130 billion plus in guarantees and funding from the government because of just these contracts. So if the issue is the fear that we don't know about what her health is and what's going to happen, answer, which is a good one, is disclosure. If I knew more about Laura, then maybe I wouldn't buy a swap contract from her insuring the credit of Steve. But there's another one. We can replace our contract, the bilateral contract I have with Laura, with a central counterparty, with someone who stands in the middle and guarantees the performance of our contract, a clearinghouse, as you were. So if you've ever bought stock on NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange, have you ever wondered who sold it to you, and did you have to worry if they paid or not? I don't know if you ever thought about that. You're law students. You probably don't think about things like that. Finance guys do. So anyway, you could worry about that. The answer is you don't have to worry about it because immediately it's what's known as novated to a central counterparty who says, you bought that stock from someone on the New York Stock Exchange, someone else is going to make the payment if they welch. You'll always get your shares. You just don't have to worry about it. Same thing with a credit default swap. If we created a central counterparty, they could stand in for Laura's credit. And that's what we're trying to create in the United States. We now have couple competing proposals for entities to create central counterparties. These entities will stand there. We'll go into this $50 trillion over-the-counter swap market. We'll cut our deal, and then we'll go hand in hand to the central counterparty. Given our contracts, our bilateral contract, they'll spit back 2 contracts, me to the central counterparty, Laura to the central counterparty, and that'll take out the contract of me to Laura. So there's an example of where we explicitly look to take away central counterparty credit risk and replace it with a central counterparty that's its members, has equity, has margin, has risk management, and all that good stuff. Should help with systemic risk. So it's a construction that's an alternative to in Laura's structured disclosure or anything else that we try and create ex ante. The trouble is it's voluntary. She and I found each other in the credit default swap market over the counter and got a deal, but something has to make us walk up to that central counterparty and swap our contracts. Right now, in the current design that we're dreaming up, that will be optional. Question is, if it doesn't work with what we're creating, would Congress have to legislate to force us to go there and novate those contracts into the center counterparty? We'll see whether that's the case or not, but hopefully some of these things will be up and operating in the first couple of months of next year. That's it.
Steve, take a couple minutes.
If I could, that one of the interesting issues I was going to say about the credit default swaps, and I think what Erik is saying makes a lot of sense, but credit default swaps are basically contracts. I mean, they're contracts about other contracts. That's one way of thinking about them. A simple guarantee could be couched as a credit default swap and vice versa. Agreement, can be couched as a credit derivative. And one of the interesting issues is going to be, if you have this system, how are you going to define what is actually, included as a credit default swap to include in it? How do you do that, Erik? I'd be intrigued.
Well, all right, so it's a good question. The point is we can create all sorts of credit default swaps, lots of flavors, lots of whatever you call them, right? And the thing is, the centrally clear thing is only going to clear plain vanilla. They all have to look exactly the same. But, this happens all the time. The best example of this is in financial innovation. Look at the futures market. Futures market has the Eurodollar futures, which is a very specific kind of interest rate future that goes out a few years. Those are used to lay off risk in the interest rate swaps markets. And so what happens, what I'm really saying is that this thing isn't going to be the be-all to end-all. It's just going to be a vehicle to moderate and lay off a bunch of risk in a very specific way. All the really, really fancy stuff is going to be done in the over-the-counter markets. But if we create a vehicle to moderate and spread that risk with a central counterparty and to take out the counterparty risk, I think that's going to go a long way in that way. It won't get it all. I don't mean to imply it's going to get it all. It'll just get a big slug of it. And there's lots of examples where innovation occurs at the margin, but the bulk, the core, can be managed in a central format. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen here.
It's probably worth noting that even though we focus on the credit default swap as being sort of the big boogeyman in the room at the moment, it's actually a relatively small proportion of all over-the-counter derivatives. And this credit counterparty risk is now to the extent where people are fearful of even getting their interest rate swaps paid. So, it's an issue that deserves serious attention, the idea of a counterparty, some sort of clearinghouse or some sort of settlement procedure where you can take the mutualization of the counterparty risk and put it into one institution for a number of different types of instruments, not just credit default swaps, which is, of course, the flavor of the day and probably the most dangerous thing at the moment because there's so much uncertainty about who holds what and where. But certainly this should be applied sort of more across the board to other types of derivatives that are traded in the over-the-counter market.
Steve, did you have any other responses, or should we turn to questions?
Well, I could say many things, but I think the audience would probably rather say things.
Okay. You were on notice. You've thought of good questions. What do you want to ask? Let me ask you one, since that's my role as a moderator. While everybody else is thinking how to follow up, you talked a little bit, in your story about complexity, and I think Laura touched on this as well. What do you think the market is going to reset to after things stabilize a little bit in terms of demand for security regarding complexity? Is the market going to say from now on, let's follow Warren Buffett's advice and only buy what we understand? or is something else going to happen? I mean, are we going to see a fundamental shift in market demand for complex securities?
Well, I think it's a good question, Don, and I'm just telling you what the judgment is, which may be completely wrong, and I'm sure that Erik and Laura about this than I, but I suspect that you're going to see the market go to a lot of plain vanilla type of securities. In fact, after Enron, we saw the same type of reaction. Enron was very complicated, and there were some basically a lot of complex products that otherwise would have been sold after Enron. No one wanted to buy. I think the classic example was Krispy Kreme, the very healthy donut company, which was going to issue a synthetic securities transaction. It was shortly after Enron, and the board decided that no one would, it wouldn't really get the demand to get the investment, so they scratched it. Articles about investors basically taking discounts on complex securities. Of course, that lasted a couple of years, and then investors started getting even more sophisticated. One of the issues is that if you want to invest in something, you might want to get a higher return. You can get a higher return if something is more complex or there's a greater risk. This goes back to the empirical data found by Businessweek after the Marriott split, which I had mentioned, where investors, after a short period of time, go for the gold. And I'll give you the what was found. Marriott, basically, back in the early 90s, I think it was, had been a company that combined hotel ownership and also management fees for Marriott hotels that were sold off. The hotel ownership part of it was a pretty stinky business. The management was a terrific business. And so Marriott split itself in two, whereby you had two separate entities, and all the debt stayed with the hotel entity, and all the creditors, the bondholders there, were really quite upset because even though the company wasn't insolvent, it wasn't nearly as strong a company as it was. So in the year after this happened, about 30, if you looked at public indenture issues, about 30 of them had what you call event risk covenants against this type of thing happening. And the year after that, about 20 indentures had covenants. And this sort of, wiggled down to one or two about 5 years after. Investors tend to get over the concerns and tend to look to more the yield. And I suspect that in another 5, certainly 10 years, we're going to go through a lot of this again. We're going to have things that are more complicated than we could even conceive of right now.
You still have chances. Yes, Michael.
Isn't the clearinghouse that you just suggested Fannie?
Is the clearinghouse Fannie? I think not in the following sense. I mean, Fannie is a particular entity that's a business. It's profit maximizing, is publicly held. So this thing is not necessarily that. It may be part of that, but it's not. It's just a business on its own. It's run. I think, if run correctly, it should be run in a very transparent way. It should have a very, very narrow purpose. I think government-sponsored enterprises have much more complex objective functions than a well-run central counterparty.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, what do you see of the role of the courts? I mean, right now we have a business judgment rule, which is obviously very deferential and gives a lot of basically self-regulation to the corporate decision makers. Do you think that the court should interfere more and play a more involved regulation role, and this would help solve anything? I'm not sure how tangential this is. I'm still trying to understand.
Let me take a shot a little bit from the international point of view. One of the problems that we have currently is we have a set of institutions that are being unwound, and some of those institutions have cross-border linkages, and they're being unwound within an individual bankruptcy code. And this really is a difficult situation because different types of holders of securities have different priority based on the legal code which exists within the country. And in addition, some countries, and I would push toward this model a little bit, some countries have judges that expressly do financial sector types of things. And so bank unwindings and bank bankruptcy codes are different in some countries than regular corporation unwindings. And that kind of thing, I think it would be an important model to start to look carefully at. Banks are just different types of entities, and they have different types of interests than a corporate. And many judges and many other types of people that deal with courts don't understand the way a bank is structured. And as a result, bank unwindings tend to take too long. They tend not to, sort of in a very clean way. I'm sure Erik can talk about this in the case of Lehman, because they've had lots of issues in the Japanese context and in the UK context where these unwindings are very difficult when you don't have sort of an overall bankruptcy code that's expressly for these types of financial institutions. Now, how active they should be, I'm going to leave alone, but it would be really nice if there was some consistency, because as these institutions become more global, it's just going to become messier and more time-consuming, and that just adds to the uncertainty and adds to the systemic risk that accompanies these kinds of unwinds.
And let me add, if I may, unless...
No, go ahead.
And it may be that I'm responding beyond the scope of the question you asked, but I'm very skeptical about trying to second-guess business people and business decisions. I think the business judgment rule makes sense. I think to try to get courts to say, hey, you should have done something different, for example, is a dangerous way to go, just as I think that trying to micromanage companies or investors as to how they invest, or try to micromanage originators as to how they make loans, can backfire. One of the problems with complexity that I didn't get into, I have a piece coming out called Complexity as a Catalyst of Market Failure, a Law and Engineering Inquiry, looks to how complexities in engineering systems can cause unintended consequences, and it's the same thing as complex sort of nonlinear financial systems can also have unintended consequences. So that's not a precise answer, but is simply to say that I'm very skeptical about any sort of micromanaging by courts, by regulators, and so forth. Yeah.
I have a question about financial innovation and what seems to be a perpetual gap between market innovation and regulators' ability to see what risks are posed by financial innovation. The financial innovation that I'm thinking about occurs in two categories. One is the product innovation of credit defaults, swaps, and the securitization trust. The other is the accounting innovations. I'm putting innovations in air quotes. Changes, both the speed and complexity of the changes, seem to always defy the ability of regulators to penetrate the thicket presented by the innovation. It's a problem that seems to be a perpetual problem that poses systemic risks simply the gap between what the regulators know about what the market is doing in accounting, innovation, and product innovation, and then what response they have formulated to address the innovation that they see. And I'll just put a footnote to that. In this current crisis, I'm looking forward, not back. In this current crisis, the problem that we have experienced is that this innovation gap was supposed to be filled in agencies. They were supposed to be the market sector charged with penetrating and keeping track of the complexity of the financial innovation. The trouble is, we now find out that their models were built on experience that started in 2000, and they had no variable in their models for housing market that went down. So back to the basic question, which is the gap. The gap that seems virtually built in, baked in the cake between market innovators, yield chasers, and regulators, who always seem to be either fighting the last war or caught flat-footed, catching up to either the product innovation or the, I'm sorry,
I'm not a regulator. I want to make that clear.
I am, but he is, yeah.
I didn't have, but my disclosure, I'm not a regulator.
But, what
He's not now.
About is, every crisis we've had from, the .com bust, there's always Enron, WorldCom, there's always some innovation, and the regulators don't catch up with it.
Right.
How to deal with that, both product and accounting?
So there's an old saw in the field of finance that says the two most important sources of innovation are taxes and regulation. Right? I think there's a lot of truth to that, because a lot of innovation is meant to circumvent one or both. So that's by design, so it's not by just chance. The second thing, and I say this a bit tongue-in-cheek, but only a bit, is it's efficient not to understand all pieces of regulation of innovation in the following sense. Like anything that's new, most of it dies. So if we were to craft a scheme that fully understood every piece of new innovation in financial services, that would be grossly inefficient, because 99% of products that are newly designed don't make it. You've never heard of them. You've heard of credit default swaps because they were wildly successful, just like you've heard of options and any number of other instruments. So I think the preferred form you want is a form that actually doesn't regulate too heavily the newest, most innovative things, because most of them aren't going to make it. The thing you want to watch for is the ones that get large, that come up and hit a size where you realize they are going to be substantial. And the trouble with those, let's take, we can talk about credit default swaps, or you can talk about accounting, whatever you want, is in the case of credit default swaps, they were designed to go into a space where no regulator had authority. They were crafted that way. And that's true about many things you take off balance sheet accounting. Well, guess what? If you look at certain civs, certain vehicles that were getting around certain things, banks have leverage tests, right? Securities firms don't. So guess where the civs were? They were with commercial banks. Why? To get around a leverage test to put balance sheet. So where you do something with one hand to control risk, leverage in the case of a commercial bank, it's going somewhere else. It just because, and the reason for that is to get around regulation. It is a continual battle. The likelihood, the likelihood that regulators can, in the long run, get out ahead and forecast what the innovations will be, I think is low probability.
Steve, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're about finished.
Sure. I agree entirely with what Erik says. And in fact, I'm not sure that regulators should even attempt to get out ahead, because there would be a tendency to overregulate and potentially some innovations that I think that human, we ultimately have a system where there's going to be problems, and we're not going to be able to anticipate them all. This is one reason, for example, why I sort of step back in sort of exasperation and say, maybe the proper response is not even attempting, at least, to try to anticipate everything that could go wrong, but rather to look to how problems become systemically catastrophic, and it through, again, the market liquidity provider, in addition to the institutional liquidity provider we already have now. And that was the intention of doing that. The other thing you said that rating agencies are charged with penetrating to keep track of innovations. I wish that were so. I think that investors ultimately take the risk, and I think that investors probably should have relied less on rating agencies and should have taken more steps themselves to understand the products they were buying.
All right, we've hit 5 o'clock, so first of all, I want to thank Steve for a wonderful paper and presentation, and our two commentators, Laura and Erik, for insightful comments. Thank you all.
Erik, if there is a way you can email me your comments, I would love to.
They weren't. I just talking.
I didn't know. It's an idea. Great. I'm sorry.